Hey friends, welcome back to Biblical Thinking. Once again, my name is Ray and I'm your host, and we are back with another devotional thought. Our devotional thought today comes from Genesis chapter 10 towards the end, and also Genesis chapter 11. Yes, friends, we are going to be talking about the story of the Tower of Babel. Two of the scriptures first I want to talk about during this time is found in Genesis chapter 10. One of them is in verse 25, and the other is Genesis 10 chapter verse 32. What we want to do with this devotional is talk about just a thought in regards to basically how our world came to be. Not necessarily the creation, but our world in general, as we see different nations scattered throughout the world. Different people are scattered throughout the world. We have different ethnicities: Asian, American, if you want to call it, Spanish. We have just different portions of people that settle throughout the world that have different ethnicities. They have different languages. They all look a little different. Yet, when we look at each other's society, we can see so many commonalities. One of us would have to think we're all the same. And by this, I mean, if you live here in the United States, and say, have you ever seen someone that lived maybe in South America, or maybe someone who lives in Russia, or someone who lives in Africa? Regardless of skin tone, you actually see people that kind of look similar. You know, they always say that everyone has a twin, right? Well, sometimes there's more than twins. Sometimes there's triplets. I myself have ran into someone who looks just like me, and it kind of freaked me out, right? Then I've heard other people at the same time say, "Hey, I seen this guy over here. I seen this guy over here. Looks exactly like you. Even has the same glasses, the same style of haircut, etc., etc." Right? And so we all have our twins, but I've seen people who I've seen from other countries that look like friends that I have here in the States. So one of the commonalities that we can find is, yes, we all look like each other. Yes, there are some differences in skin tone, some different facial features, but in all, a lot of us actually look alike. Notwithstanding the biological differences, right, or the similarities, two hands, 2 feet, 10 toes, 2 eyes, 2 ears, those things. But I'm talking more like facial features, and even the way we act. Even if we come from different societies, we still have tendencies to act the same. And what about our speech, our languages? Yes, there's many different languages in this world, but what's interesting about all the different languages is they all have a commonality, a root base to every single language. They all goes back to one, right? So it's not like one language all just came up out of the blue. No, there's a root to all these languages, to where all the languages of the world share commonality. We find that across the board. Any of you who speak different languages will understand that, because you'll find that several words mean the same in other different languages, or they're spelt the same but they're maybe said different, or they're said different but spelt the same, but still the root is there, right? So when you understand those languages, you'll see, hey, there's a commonality. Why is that? Well, we do find that in the creation story in Genesis, that God created just Adam and Eve, right? We all know that. We all know the story. They had kids from there on. But we do find that after the flood, that there was just the families of Noah, right? Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives, and they began to start populating the world again. Well, the problem with that is, as they continued, sin still had not left the world, even though God destroyed it with the flood. There was still sin, the leftovers of sin still left in humanity. And as humanity began to populate and grow, just like the time before the flood, they begin to go against God. They begin to turn away from the teachings of God, and basically want to be whatever they became without God. And we find this story and we pick it up in Genesis chapter 10, and mainly in Genesis chapter 11 with the story of the Tower of Babel. But one thing we do find is, what the Bible does is it'll explain a story, and then it'll go on to the next chapter, and then go back to the story and go into detail, similar to Genesis chapter 1 and 2, where it talks about the creation, of the world in chapter 1, and then chapter 2 fills in the details of that creation in chapter 1. And that's what we find here in Genesis chapter 10 and 11, because we have here a lineage of people from the time of Noah and his family. And verse 25 comes up to this scene that we find in Genesis chapter 11. And it talks about Peleg. And it says, "And unto Eber were born two sons. The name of one was Peleg. For in his days," that's in the time that Peleg lived, right? "In his days was the earth divided, and his brother's name was Joktan." So during the time of Peleg, something started to happen to where the earth started to separate. And this could mean not only the physical literal earth, but also the people as well, because it ties into the story of the Tower of Babel in Genesis chapter 11. Now, verse 32 also implies this, that these are the families of the sons of Noah, right? So chapter 10 is giving us the family lineage of his sons. And it says that after their generations in their nations, and by these were the nations divided in the earth after the flood. So here it tells us that these people were divided after the flood. There was something, some type of event that the flood caused, that these people would be divided. That's not necessarily saying that the earth was divided after the flood, like immediately after the flood or during the flood, but something started to happen after the flood, because you have these generations of Noah's sons unto chapter 11, right? To where there's a dividing. And what was that dividing? Now, some people, we tend to look back at what the historians call Pangea, right? That all the continents were one, and then some cataclysmic thing happened and divided it. This is basically what they're talking about. But it goes on to say in chapter 11 that the people should have been followers of God. But somehow, when God destroyed the world with the flood, it was to end all the evil that was happening at the time. The Bible tells us that men's hearts are continual evil, right? But now we have lineage of many, many families, and now all of a sudden we're back to the same thing, right? But what is the problem that's transpiring here in Genesis chapter 11? We find here that the people are getting together. And verse 1 says, "And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech." So this is why I talked about how all our languages that we find here on earth today, there's a commonality, a root between all languages. Because if we're Bible believing Christians, we believe that in the beginning there wasn't many languages, that there was only one. So up to the time here in the flood, from Adam and Eve all the way up to the time here of Genesis chapter 11, there was only one language here in this world. And something happened to where that changed. And we find here that the men decided that they needed to build a brick tower. And they began fashioning a tower full of brick and stone to build a tower. And they wanted this tower to go up and reach the heights of the heaven. And the reason why they did it says, "Lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." That's verse 4. So what was one of their reasonings for building the tower? They basically wanted to build them a city. They saw the whole earth. They knew there was a big place, but they did not want to scatter. These men wanted to stay together and build something big, right? But yet we find here that God had told Adam to, "This is your world, fill it," right? Take dominion of it, keep it, fill it. So man's job was basically to populate the whole world. But these men didn't want to populate the world. They wanted to build, in a sense, like their own city, their own tower. And this tower would be not a thing that glorifies God, but it would be something to glorify themselves, because they made it. And it would be like a tower or central location to where people say, "Yeah, these men built it. This is the center of our society." And God saw that. he saw that they built a tower. And the Lord said, behold, the people is one. So he's recognizing that these people came together to do this. And he said, and they all have one language. He's reaffirming again. And this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. Now, you remember before the flood, the Bible says that the hearts of men were continually evil, right? And that's a phrase to use like the way we act, right? And also the way we act comes in the way we think. Yet here he uses similar language, but with a different description by saying, nothing will be restrained from them. All these people who built the tower, which have imagined to do. So basically, what God is saying, that these men, whatever they feel like or how they think, they're going to create it as long as they're together. Which, if they're going to go against God, they're going to do so collectively, not as scattered groups. They're going to do so all at once. So it says that the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build a city. So notice what the people wanted to do was erect this tower, right? And their fear was, we want to erect this tower because we want to stay here as our central location. We do not want to be scattered throughout the earth. And then in chapter 10, it tells us in the days of Peleg, the earth was divided, right? And also tells us that, and at the last verse of chapter 10, when it gives us the lineage, that the people were scattered throughout the earth. So that's the biggest fear of the people here after the flood, the descendants of Noah's sons, is that they want to stay together. They don't want to be separated. They don't want to fulfill what God had instructed Adam and Eve to do, was to populate the world. No, they want to stick together to form their own society, and instead of God being the center figure, it was going to be this tower. So because that's what they wanted, we're told that's what God took away, right? Because it says that the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth. So what did God do? He scattered the people all throughout the earth, and they left off to build the city. Therefore the name of it is called Babel, because the Lord did not there confounded their languages of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth. Now what's interesting just about these several first 9 verses that we read and the other 2 in chapter 10 is, if we take these in context and just look at today's society, we can say, yes, that's where they came from. That's where everybody in the world came from. Yes, there was a central location when God created Adam and Eve. Then after the flood, there was a central location where Noah and his sons and their descendants were. And they were afraid to be scattered across the world. So in defiance to God, they built a tower because they did not want to fulfill God's mission for the people. So they built their own city, their own tower. It kind of going against God, right? Saying this is the symbol of us not following God. And their biggest fear was that they didn't want to be scattered away from each other, because they knew while they were together they could accomplish anything. And God recognized that. And so what did he do? He came down and he confounded their language. And what did that do to them? That made them now not be able to work together to build anything, but now they would have to be separated in groups. And they grouped together based off what? If you just use some common sense, they grouped together based off the language the person was speaking. So however many languages it was, God made them speak different languages so they couldn't communicate with one another. So whoever spoke one language, they all grouped together, and this other group grouped together who spoke this other language. They didn't intermingle because no one knew what each other was saying. It would take time before they would learn that, right? But before it took time for them to learn that, what did God do? He scattered them across the world. And I'm sure they got scattered across the world with their group of people who spoke. Whether God sent them and all of a sudden they appeared somewheres, that could be the case. Or could it be that still the landmass was still breaking up and there were still bridges, that what we believe is is that all these people, because they had different languages, migrated to different parts of the world, and then that's where they settled, and they stayed there this whole time, right? And what we could see here throughout history, through our archaeology, is that you'll find that many of the buildings, especially like pyramids, ziggurats, which are different types of pyramids, the structures of society throughout all the world, they're the same. Yes, there was some that increased more knowledge faster than others, but that's not to say that they weren't from the same society. Because if you look in the history of the natives, you look in the history of the Asians, you look in the history of the English, Germanic, whatever the case may be, we all have similar backstories. And upon coming to this world, it was interesting that many people found that a lot of the natives in South America and North America all had flood stories and origins of the flood. So they all came from the same place, which is here at the Tower of Babel. It's just because of their disobedience they got scattered throughout the world. But they still understood about society, so they built upon the principles of their new society based off the old ones. That's why they're all so similar. The buildings are similar. The ways they worship are similar. And a lot of them became pagan without God. Some followed God but changed the name into something different, right? So it's when we look at these things in history, it's not evolution, it's actually God working here. And this in chapter 11 explains where the different races and the different ethnicities and languages came from. It's because God scattered them together because they were causing so much evil, and He didn't want them to cause that, because they not would harm themselves. So He separated with them so they can grow up in different societies, right? And there's much more to that, but I just wanted to throw that out there because most people don't look at that point of view of history, when it clearly states how we all started here and how we all became about throughout the whole world. It wasn't just people on the other side of the world who were there living forever, and all of a sudden they decided, okay, I'm gonna get on a boat and go across the ocean and end up in the Americas, like we find with Columbus or whatever. And as we all know, there were natives here already when Columbus got here, but most people think that there was nobody was here in the U.S. or in the South Americas for what they call hundreds of thousands of years, right? Because of evolution. No, there are people all over the world at the same time after this incident in the flood. They're just so separated, they never really had contact for a very long time. But the evidence, the archaeological evidence, is there to show that there are similar minds, similar structures, similar society, similar buildings. And like I said, the languages, the key is in the detail. Look at all the languages of the world. They all have the same root, which comes back to the biblical story of they were all of one language. Well, I hope you enjoyed this short devotional. I hope you have a good day, good week, and I pray that you all are blessed in abundance. Have a good one, and keep believing and keep studying the Word.